Michigan State University's new strategic plan articulates a shared vision for the university through the end of the decade. MSU Strategic Plan 2030, Empowering Excellence, Advancing Equity, and Expanding Impact, received the unanimous endorsement of the MSU Board of Trustees. MSU Strategic Plan 2030 identifies goals within 6 key themes: student success, staff and faculty success, discovery, creativity, and innovation for excellence and global impact, sustainable health, stewardship and sustainability, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. On this edition of MSU Today, we'll be focusing on the diversity, equity, and inclusion theme of the plan with its executive sponsor, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer Jabbar Bennett. To set the scene for my conversation with Dr. Bennett, here's Michigan State University President Samuel L. Stanley Jr., MD.
So thank you, Russ. Great to be with you. And again, thank you again for these podcasts. Really pleased you're able to talk to our very distinguished CDO, Jabbar Bennett, today about DEI and its role in the strategic plan. Even though we have a separate plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm sure we're going to come across and talk about that a little bit. It really felt it was important, and everybody who was involved in this process felt it was important that it be included as a pillar in the strategic plan as well. It cuts across so many aspects of our campus, and it's so important to us going forward. I've talked many times about the need to have a place where people feel welcome, where people feel that they're a part of this university and are welcomed at this university. And that's really what DEI is about. It's providing opportunity, it's providing support, and it's providing ways in which we can continue to help people reach their full potential. So I'm excited about this. And again, I look forward to a great discussion.
Well, Dr. Bennett, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to MSU Today and for the first time in the studio.
Thank you, Russ. It's great to be here in the studio with you. And we had a wonderful conversation when I first arrived, and I look forward to hopping into this one.
Me too. So thank you for being here. And let's start by, how does Michigan State University, how does the strategic plan define diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Thank you so much, Russ. That is a very important question because it's important for all of us to recognize that diversity, equity, and inclusion are 3 different things with their own definitions and application that work together and complement each other. And all 3 of these things, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are foundational principles and practices that we must embrace as Spartans if we really want to get where it is we say we want to go. And if I give you a simple definition of diversity, it's really the varied collective and individual identities and differences within a group of people. And the DEI Steering Committee, or the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Steering Committee, really described diversity in the following way. They said diversity represents our varied collective and individual identities and differences, and that we recognize that diversity is a central component of inclusive excellence in research, teaching, service, and outreach and engagement. They went further to say we are committed to engaging, understanding, promoting, and fostering a variety of perspectives and affirm our similarities and value our differences. I'll go on to say a bit about equity, and I want to start with a simple definition before I talk about how members of our community thought about equity within the institutional context. So defined simply, equity is the ability to, or actions taken to, ensure access to resources that promote success and address past and present educational and professional disparities. The Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Steering Committee went a bit further and talked about equity as going beyond fair treatment, opportunity, and access to information and resources for all, and said that equity can only be achieved in an environment built on respect and dignity that acknowledges historic and contemporary injustices. And finally, regarding equity, we have to be committed to intentionally and actively redressing barriers, challenging discrimination and bias, and institutionalizing access and resources that address historical and contemporary social inequalities. And finally, simply and briefly, inclusion is the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded. So our colleagues and students in the DEI Steering Committee talked about inclusion the following way. that inclusion actively invites all to contribute and participate. In the face of exclusive differential power, we strive to create balance. Every person's voice is valuable, and no one person is expected to represent an entire community. Here at MSU, we're committed to an open environment in campus where students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community voices are equally respected and contribute to the overall institutional mission.
And one of the boldest and clearest desired outcomes stated in the strategic plan is the complete elimination of race and ethnicity opportunity gaps across all subgroups of students by 2030. How will MSU get there?
You know, Russ, in thinking about your question, I want to first recognize the efforts and trajectory of how these plans came together into being, because I think that may help our audience understand this emphasis on race and ethnicity as it relates to opportunity gaps and in general. So I like to refer to calendar years 2020 and 2021 as phase one of our overall institutional strategic planning efforts as we focused on plan development, looking at major areas of concern and interest as we thought about our future. So over the past 2 years, several institutional planning initiatives related to diversity, equity, inclusion took place, which included the University Strategic Planning Committee and its process, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Steering Committee and their work, a subcommittee of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Steering Committee called the Task Force on Racial Equity. And I'll take a moment to say that the president charged the DEI Steering Committee along with the University Steering Committee back in December 2019. And these groups convened for the first time back in January 2020. But in May of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, President Stanley thought it was really important that the institution take time to think about what were more immediate actions that we could take to address key concerns that members of our campus community have expressed. And the areas that they looked at include climate and safety, policing, and faculty and staff diversity. So that is when the Task Force on Racial Equity was established, and we utilized campus experts along with members of the DEI Steering Committee to help inform those efforts. It's also important to note two additional institution-wide planning processes that took place during the same period: the Relationship Violence and Sexual Misconduct Expert Advisory Work Group, and in addition, the Short-Term Work Group on Names and Pronouns. And findings and recommendations from these committees also contribute to our current efforts around planning for implementation, which I refer to as phase 2 of this process. Now, coming back to your original question, what I think you're referring to is the DEI goal mentioned in the University Strategic Plan, or MSU 2030, that calls for ensuring equity and eliminating disparities on our campus and beyond. And you can find that information on page 33 of that document. In addressing opportunity gaps, such as the difference between graduation rates across different subgroups, you'll find that the MSU 2030 plan was designed to intentionally integrate DEI across every strategic theme noted in the document, such as student success and all the others. MSU has long been invested in student success, and that is evident. For the 6th straight year, MSU saw a record high graduation rate of 82% for first-time, full-time undergraduate students. Graduation rates for students who identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian American, Black or African American, Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and Hispanic or Latinx all increased as well. However, Black and African American undergraduate students continue to have slightly lower graduation rates of around 65%. The MSU 2030 goal of guaranteeing an 86% graduation rate for the entering 2024 class will require persistence, enabled by the Student Success Initiative, which aims to support the success of all Spartans. I work closely with Vinnie Gore, Senior Vice President of Student Life and Engagement, and Mark Largent, Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education and Dean of Undergraduate Studies, on our Student Success Initiative planning and execution. Every day, Mark Largent and his team are working to ensure that all MSU students receive the support they need to learn, persist, and graduate in a timely fashion, and that equity, inclusion, diversity, and global competency are integrated into every aspect of their undergraduate experience. And I really think utilizing a lens of racial equity in teaching and educational outcomes is central to understanding, naming, and working to proactively tackle those issues to further eliminate educational opportunity gaps. In my office, we recently hosted MSU's first institutional diversity and inclusion speaker series, and this was a way to bring into conversation experts on diversity, equity, and inclusion to help position MSU as a leader in this area. The speaker series, which took place on March 24th, featured Michigan State University's very own esteemed professor Dorinda Carter Andrews, the first Black woman chairperson of the nationally ranked Department of Teacher Education in the College of Education. In the talk, Dr. Andrews addressed the myths and misconceptions around teaching race and racism in education and pedagogy. She laid out the main tenets of critical race theory to help our community learn how to broach the subject in the classroom, as well as dispel misunderstanding about what it is. If you missed the event, I highly encourage this listening audience to check out the recording, and there are also some additional learning resources available on my office website as well. All of this will help to gain a clear, factual, and objective understanding and perspective around what critical race theory is, which is actually an acknowledgement of the impact of race and racism on education and outcomes. But I digress. There are numerous efforts across campus that address opportunity gaps, from efforts in student life and engagement with OCAT, or the Office of Cultural and Academic Transitions, through the Magic Summer Transition Program, now in its 25th year. There are new pilot programs such as Ignite, the Summer Bridge program in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences that receive funding from my office's Creating Inclusive Excellence Grant program. These collective efforts earned MSU its first Generation Forward designation, which we should all celebrate. And this brings me more directly to the work that's happening in my office today. Closing opportunity gaps really requires a focus on ensuring our faculty and staff are also able to exceed. We sponsor a major awards program, the Excellence in Diversity Awards, soon to be renamed the Excellence in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Awards, to be more inclusive of our future recipients' broad contributions toward advancing these efforts. We also host annual commemorations and celebrations, such as the Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta celebration, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative celebration, the Juneteenth commemorative celebration, and a new faculty and staff welcome reception. Our education and development team provides various offerings, which include Anti-Racist Path Dialogue Series, DEI Foundation's online educational module, Implicit Bias Certificate Program, MSU Dialogues, Transforming Theater Ensemble, and limited consultations related to instruction and facilitator training. Each year, we sponsor the Creative Inclusive Excellence Grant Program, which I mentioned before, and this is an opportunity for groups and units to submit a proposal for an innovative way to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. Each proposal could result in support totaling up to $15,000, and we encourage applicants to secure matching funds from their home departments, colleges, or units to leverage our support and broaden their impact. And finally, I can't say enough about the Diversity Research Network, or DRN, that my colleague, MSU Foundation Professor Dr. Deborah Johnson leads. The DRN provides various types of support to scholars of color and others who engage in diversity-related research. The network also helps to connect people, elevate the visibility of their individual scholarship, and build community. What we know is that diversity among leadership and tenured faculty is key to recruiting and retaining diverse students as well as colleagues, and it's critical in creating an inclusive and welcoming campus climate for all.
And as you mentioned, MSU has a whole plan dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. How does that plan relate to or complement the DEI theme in the strategic plan, and how do they fit together?
Thanks so much, Russ. I'm glad you asked that question. So our team in the Office for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion has been working very hard to review the recommendations laid out in the university's strategic plan and DEI Steering Committee report and plan. What we found is that many of the recommendations identified in those plans, as well as the Task Force on Racial Equity report, are similar and many of those recommendations have been accomplished or are underway. In addition, as I mentioned before, we continue to explore recommendations that emerge from work conducted last spring by the short-term work group on names and pronouns. We have been tracking progress and partnering with various executive administrative leaders, as well as groups and individuals to review and prioritize all of these recommendations. Accordingly, the DEI Strategic Theme Steering Committee was recently established to support the implementation and success of key institutional diversity, equity, inclusion priorities. This was mentioned in my recent announcement to faculty and staff back in mid-March. In the announcement, I also shared the alignment of recommendations between the University Strategic Plan, or MSU 2030, and the DEI Steering Committee report and plan, as they do actually inform each other, and that was by design. I identified 5 objectives from MSU 2030, which support the goal of becoming a national leader in increasing diversity, promoting inclusion, ensuring equity, and eliminating disparities on our campus and beyond. And I laid out in a table how the DEI Steering Committee report and plans for strategic goals of increasing diversity, ensuring equity, promoting inclusion, and enhancing outreach and engagement closely align with those 5 objectives. To approach this work, we're utilizing a comprehensive and inclusive framework that invites faculty, staff, students, alumni, and others to engage with various action planning teams that are currently being established by the DEI Strategic Theme subcommittee members. Action planning teams will partner with the DEI Strategic Theme subcommittee members to provide overall feedback on the approach to implementation, partner with executives to review and prioritize recommendations, consider the proposed metrics, evaluate and expand on those suggested metrics, and also explore individual and unit-based accountability measures. In the coming months, the campus community and this audience can expect additional updates on our progress as we work to explore implementation of various recommendations and their associated actions, as well as how we can be held accountable to do our part in this very important work.
And if we're successful in being a national leader in DEI initiatives, what will we have achieved, and how do you think MSU will look different by 2030?
Yes. As you mentioned, being a national leader was part of the charge from President Stanley, not only in the university strategic planning process, but also to the DEI Steering Committee. I think for many of the reasons I've already stated, Michigan State University, being a member of the AAU, a Research One institution, a global DEI leader, and part of the Big Ten, has often sat at the helm as a leading land-grant institution. MSU is home to over 9,000 international students and scholars, which represent more than 140 countries. As a top 100 global university committed to DEI, MSU prioritizes collaboration across campus to ensure that all members of our community feel welcome, safe, and supported. Furthermore, as a research institution, MSU is positioned as a leader with partnerships around the world. And I say all of that to say that I think by 2030, we will have expanded inclusive practices around local and global diversity, equity, inclusion. And by 2030, we have strengthened our ability to assess and report on achievements on a regular basis, while also putting into effect DEI dashboards for reporting on major academic and administrative units.
So, Jabbar, some final thoughts or key takeaways from our conversation that you'd like listeners to have?
Absolutely. I'd like to underscore that for each of the plans that I mentioned, they were all developed by members of this community, students, faculty, staff, and even alumni, because we have students, faculty, and staff who've already earned a degree from MSU. It'll take every member of this community to recognize their role, the work that they have to do, that we have to do in order to make this work successful. We all have a responsibility, and there are ways that we can contribute to advancing these efforts within our local circles and communities, as well as collectively, when we work with groups, partner with colleagues in different units. But Russ, in closing, what I would like to say is that it's really great to be here, and I would also like to congratulate you on your 25th anniversary here at Michigan State University that I know you celebrated recently. And thank you for bearing witness to these stories and voices of our great establishment for a quarter of a century. You have helped to make MSU a point of pride for many, far and wide, and we can hear your pride in your voice in every show. Your work is undoubtedly interwoven into the social fabric that makes us who we are. So with that, congratulations to you, and go green.
Go White. On this edition of MSU Today, we've been talking about the diversity, equity, and inclusion theme of MSU's Strategic Plan 2030, empowering excellence, advancing equity, and expanding impact, with the executive sponsor of the theme, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer Jabbar Bennett. Read and learn more about MSU Strategic Plan 2030 at strategicplan.msu.edu. I'm Russ White for MSU Today.